Our study of the book of Numbers continues today with Numbers chapter 9 and 10. I titled the devotional, Listen to the Sound of the Trumpet. Let's open our Bibles to Numbers chapter 9 and 10. Well, in Numbers chapter 9, we have in verses 1 through 5 a reminder concerning the Passover memorial. Now, Numbers 9 marks the beginning of the second year of Israel's encampment at the base of Sinai. Now, it was the first month of the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt in chapter 9 and verse 1. And then in verse 2, the Lord commanded Moses to speak to the children of Israel to keep the Passover. And so the Lord instituted the Passover as a lasting memorial of the night he spared the firstborn of Israel from death. Now you might remember that all the way back in Exodus chapter 12. Well, on that night, the night that the angel of death passed over the households, where the blood of the Passover lamb was applied to the doorpost. And so the day of Passover, the observance of the Passover, is an ongoing, perpetual memorial of how God saved Israel by seeing the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost of the houses. Now that day after, the Lord liberated the children of Israel from Egyptian slavery. And then chapter 9 again, verses 6 through 14, we have the requirements concerning the observance of the Passover. And so we find recorded an occasion when some men of Israel were defiled by handling a dead body, which we read in verses 6 through 10, rendered them unclean so that they could not observe the Passover. However, God, in a wonderful exercise of divine grace, allowed those men to celebrate the Passover the following month. Now, the Lord then, in verses 15 through 22, commanded the starts and the stops of his people. Now, we've seen this on several different occasions when the Lord commands his people, and they are to be very attentive to his will and his leading. And so the tabernacle, you'll notice, served Israel as a visual reminder of God's presence amid the 12 tribes. It was in the midst of the tribes surrounding the tabernacle. Now, we read that when the sanctuary was raised, the Lord's presence was marked by a cloud that covered the tabernacle in the day. And then we read also at even there was upon the tabernacle as it were the appearance of fire until the morning. And so it served as a reminder of God's presence amid Israel as a people. In verse 16, so it was always, we read, that the cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Well, since the Lord was the shepherd of Israel, we know that he guided the nation through the wilderness. In verse 17, the people journeyed when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle. And when the cloud remained over the tabernacle, the children of Israel pitched their tents. In other words, the Lord decreed the starts and the stops for his people. They followed the movements of the cloud and the pillar of fire throughout their journey. And then briefly, Numbers chapter 10. Here we have silver trumpets heralding the movements of the tribes of Israel. Now, Israel, understand, was a theocracy, a nation whose government was under the law of God and led by spiritual leaders. Now, Aaron and his sons, the priests of Israel, were responsible for sounding the trumpets in verse 8. And so the Lord tasked the priest with communicating his direction to the people. And so notice with me verses 3 through 10. And here we have silver trumpets that sounded 4 messages. There was, verses 3 through 4, the sound to assemble. There was another sound for journeying. Thirdly, verse 9, there was a sound that was a call to arms, to war, to battle. And then fourthly, there was a sound that heralded festivals and sacrifices in verse 10. Well, of necessity, the sounds of the trumpets had to be clear and distinct for the people to understand the message. Now, notice then, verses 11 through 13, and really all the way through, the departure from Mount Sinai as it's recorded finally. After now going on 1 year and now in the second year, Numbers chapter 10, we have the nation of Israel setting out on her journey to the promised land, which was Canaan. Now, the tribe leaders, you'll notice, are named in verses 14 through 28. However, again, the cloud served as a reminder not to look to man, but to look to the Lord for his presence and protection. Indeed, we're reminded that the God of Israel was the commander-in-chief of Israel. Well, closing thoughts and a closing appeal. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul warned believers to ensure that the teaching and preaching of God's word in the congregation left no room for uncertainty. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 6. He made a similar exhortation in his epistle to Titus when he wrote, Titus 1 and verse 9, holding fast the faithful word, as he hath been taught, that he may, the preacher, may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gaysayers. That's the calling and the responsibility of ministers. Well, like the silver trumpets of Israel, preachers of God's word must not give an uncertain sound. Now, accepting nothing less than an accurate, unapologetic exposition of the word and the will of the Lord. My friend, sound the trumpet. If you're a pastor, may you be faithful and true to the revelation of God's word and will in the scriptures. God bless, and bye-bye.